In this episode, we're going to be slowing things down and getting back to the basics, the stuff that's easy to overlook once you've been painting for a while, and I'll break down the fundamentals behind my Grimdark approach, from where the ideas and inspiration come from, and how I build up my acrylic layers and apply simple yet super effective weathering. I'm Nate the Feral Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. More often than not, and I'm definitely guilty of this myself, we forget about some of the simple foundational techniques we can apply before we even think to add oils, enamels, or any of the more advanced techniques we've covered here on the Grimdark Compendium. I regularly see people paint a miniature, cover it in an enamel wash and call it Grimdark. And don't get me wrong, if you're in a pinch or painting for tabletop, a solid base coat and a wash can look pretty effective. But the question is, what can we do earlier in the process, and what small changes in the approach can have a massive impact on the final results? And by the end of this video, my goal is to give you a few tools and ideas that you can easily implement into your own painting process. These techniques, they're quite basic, they're easy, but when combined, they really elevate the end result. So first, let's talk about the inspiration and how I approach a project from the very start. I always begin by looking at references, and some of the best ones come from the games and animations. I absolutely love the look of Space Marine 2 and the Warhammer show Secret Level. They're a fantastic resource for seeing how armour should look, how it's worn, damaged and weathered. When you look closely, the armour isn't clean or flat. There's loads of mottling, chips, scratches and impact damage, with a slight sheen to the armour as well. You can also see where the dirt and grime and weathering naturally settles into its recesses. So with this in mind, where do we even begin to try and replicate this in a way that's simple and easy to understand? So starting right at the beginning, I've grabbed a model, and for this we're going to keep it simple, no crazy kit bashes or extra details, just straight out of the box. And I especially like these newer Ultramarines models. To me, they feel a little bit more like a representation of what an Ultramarine should be, that classic Roman Empire influenced, mixed with the brutal 40k aesthetic. But before we even start to think about a primer, we're going to add some subtle scuffs and battle damage directly to the model itself. With this, take your time, use a sharp tool carefully, make sure that you are working slowly and be deliberate with each mark. I focus on areas that would naturally come into contact with the environment, such as the knees, elbows, lower legs and some of the edges. Higher up on the model, I'm a little bit more restrained and just add in the occasional dent or scratch. And once all these little marks have been painted, they'll read as physical damage because they actually have some depth, and later on in the video I'll show you a few optional additions if you want to push that effect even further. If you do have a miniature that has some cloth elements like robes or a cape, it's also a great opportunity to add a tiny little bit of texture. And for this, I'm going to be using liquid green stuff. It is water soluble, so you can thin it down or apply it thicker depending on the effect that you want. I recommend starting light and building it up slowly, and using an old brush to apply it with a stippling motion. It's crucial that you do use that stippling, and as you move around the areas, make sure that you do go back over some of the areas that you've already added as it begins to dry, and this will just help create that even more natural, uneven texture. Just remember though, just that this section should be very subtle. You're not looking for big lumps or heavy build-up, just a slight rough area. And you can go a little bit too far, or if you do make any mistakes, you can always lightly sand that area back down once it's dry. And all of this happens before even a single drop of paint goes onto my miniature, but this will just set this stage for a much more convincing Grimdark results. Now, once you've completed all that previous prep work, you can then go ahead and prime your miniature in your favourite black primer. And at this stage, we can now move on to the fun stuff, and that's the base coat and foundation of the Ultramarines armour. And for this stage, I wanted an approach that has some strong contrast while still retaining some of that mottled, chipped, distressing texture. We're going to build this up using a base tone, mid-tone and highlight, but with a slightly different approach, and all of the following steps can be done with either a brush or an airbrush, but personally I like to combine both to achieve the results that I'm after. First, start by applying a zenithal style application of Citadel's Macragge Blue through an airbrush, slightly thinned with a couple of drops of thinner. The reason for using a zenithal approach, which means spraying from above at roughly a 45-degree angle, is so that it captures all the raised areas of the model. And at this stage, I'm simply laying down the initial colour. This not only establishes the base tone, but also acts as a guide for the rest of the work to come. It will leave the deeper recesses very dark, almost black, and this is a stylised choice, but one that looks effective and gives strong contrast to the end results. Once that layer has been applied and fully dried, I use the exact same colour again, but this time applied with a brush. Even though we've already used an airbrush, these new marks will be more prominent and help enhance the effect that I'm aiming for. I prefer to use dome-shaped dry brushes for this step as they're excellent for stippling, and I do load a small amount of the Macragge Blue onto the bristles and begin gently stippling and tapping across the surface. This will just help blend into the existing Macragge Blue and reinforces what we've already applied, but because we are using that stippling, it leaves behind tiny microscopic marks, and these will just read as natural mottling and subtle armour distressing. But as you work closer to the shadow areas, the stippling will create a soft, broken transition while still maintaining that mottled texture. And you can build this up with multiple passes until you're happy with the end effect. Once all that work is complete, we can then move on to adding some highlights using that same stippling technique. And for this, I introduce some Calgar Blue, and I mix it 50-50 with the Macragge Blue. And using this mix, I repeat the same stippling process, but now I focus only on the key highlighted areas. And if you're ever unsure where these should go, simply hold the model under a lamp and tilt it to see where the light naturally hits. Typically, this will be the upper shoulders, chest and exposed areas of the legs. This mix though will just add some subtle highlights whilst also layering some additional mottling. Finally, I want to push the contrast further with some sharper highlights, and because stippling can sometimes look a little bit rough, we can smooth things out by applying the final highlights again with an airbrush. And for this, I mix a small amount of white into the Calgar Blue, and adding white not only lightens up that colour, but also slightly desaturates it, keeping that effect subtle. I come in very tight with these highlights using a 0.2 needle and nozzle, and I restrict the flow of my airbrush right down, and I also lower the air pressure as well. And this will just give me maximum control and help avoid any mistakes, and working close to the model will just allow the highlights to smooth everything out while still allowing the underlying stippling to show through. At this stage though, the highlights may look a little bit exaggerated, and however that is intentional, but later weathering effects will knock them back a little bit, so I do recommend going slightly brighter than you normally would. All the work that we've just done now forms the base of our armour, ready for some further refinements. We've followed a familiar process when we're painting miniatures of base coating and highlighting, but by introducing stippling and varying our application methods, we add far more visual interest to the model. It's small changes in how we apply paint can make a huge difference to the final results. but ultimately this stippling technique can also be employed on its own if you don't own an airbrush, and this is what I also use for other sections of the miniatures armour, such as the white sections or even the cape. I just switched my brush for something smaller, and you can just repeat that same stippling process. There may be a little bit more work required, mixing a few colours just to be able to smooth out some of those transitions, but still retaining that mottled, chipped effect. Moving on now, and using Rhinox hide, I use this to both base coat the leather sections and to add small chips dotted around the armour. I'm not going to go overboard here, just enough to suggest areas where the paint has been damaged down to the underlying layer. The work we did right at the start, hacking away at certain areas, serves as a great guide for where the chips should naturally appear. Once that's done, I highlighted the leather sections using AK Hull Red, and as we did with the earlier stippling, I use more of a scratchy and a sketchy application rather than using smooth blends. This rougher brushwork will just add to that distressed look and helps the leather feel worn and used rather than the clean and pristine. Next up now are the metallics, and I use Citadel's Iron Warriors to add a few small dots inside some of those brown chips that we've previously applied to the armour. Placing these sparingly and irregularly suggests chips and dents that have gone all the way down to the paint and right through to the bare metal. But for the metal highlights, I used Vallejo Model Silver. This is applied with a light dry brush over the metallic areas, and dry brushing will naturally create tiny lines and imperfections which add to the illusion of old, well-used and battered weaponry or pieces of war gear. At this point, all that remains is the golden armour trim, and I start with Pro Acryl Dark Bronze as a warm base coat, and once that's down, I use Scale 75's Peridot Alchemy to add a broken, scratchy highlight to the raised and lighter points. Keep these highlights irregular rather than smooth, and it just again helps maintain that worn, battle-scarred feel across the whole miniature. There may be a few additional details to paint depending on the miniature that you're working on, but at this stage all the acrylic work is complete. We've painted the model much like we normally would, using familiar base coats and highlights, but by changing how we apply the paint and adapting our brush techniques, we've created a far more interesting surface. Laying down the foundations is key, as it sets up for a much more striking result once we've moved on to the weathering stages. It is just worth mentioning at this point that I did give the entire miniature a coat of satin varnish. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it'll stay in line and give the model a little bit of surface finish variation that we talk about on this channel, and also it'll help the weathering stages also be able to flow into the recesses a lot more easier. It's not necessary when using enamels, it's just something that I've just mentioned, just so we can get that little bit of a sheen that we see in the reference images, but then also it'll contrast really nice against those matte weathering effects. Just before we jump into the weathering portion of this video, I just want to take a quick moment to let you know that if you are enjoying this video and want to dive deeper into the Grimdark style, all of our work is available over at the grimdarkcompendium.com. The best value deal that we currently have running at the moment is our Trench Crusade Complete series. It's his largest project to date, with a huge amount of content and tutorials for all 6 factions of the game, and it also comes with the officially licensed enamel set, and this includes 2 of our new enamels, the Ill Omen Vermilion and Trench Grime. So if you are interested and you want to check out this bundle over at the grimdarkcompendium.com, it's the best way that you can also support us and the work that we do here. So to begin the weathering process, I'm going to start by introducing some enamels, but not in the way that we're sometimes used to using them with a unifying wash and the reductive technique. While that approach would still work, I want this stage to be a little bit more controlled, allowing me to fully manipulate how each effect behaves, and working this way will also help you develop a better understanding of the materials, and it'll encourage a more thoughtful, deliberate application. But you might be asking, so why use enamels instead of traditional acrylic washes? And the answer to that's quite simple. It's ultimately down to control. Enamels can be reactivated with mineral spirits, giving us far more flexibility when it comes to effects, and as they dry satin to matte, they naturally create a dusty, grimy finish that looks more realistic, and this is something that acrylic washes really struggle to replicate. I start with almost a pin wash application using Villainy Ink Decrepit Filth. This is a very dark brown, almost black enamel that dries satin to matte and has a slight granular texture, which is perfect for representing dusty grime. It also adds some additional contrast to the model in a way that traditional acrylic washes simply can't achieve. But to help me achieve this sort of pin wash effect, I'm going to be using a thin detail brush. Any fine detail brush will work, but I have found that these liner brushes to be particularly good, especially when it comes to accuracy and control. Now, thinning the enamel is not strictly necessary, however thinning it a little bit with mineral spirits will just help and improve the flow into those recesses. And when you're thinning your enamels, I almost treat mine like I would an acrylic paint, is I'm thinning it with water, and this is just going to help it enough just to move off the brush and flow into those recesses. But once you've loaded up some onto your brush, I tap the brush near the areas I want to apply it, and thanks to that satin varnish beneath that we applied earlier, capillary action pulls the enamel naturally into those gaps and recesses. Don't worry if some of it bleeds out onto the surrounding areas, we'll refine that a little bit later. Minor bleeds though, will actually help create a more natural organic finish. For areas that would collect heavier dust and grime, such as the legs, I apply the decrepit filth neat without thinning it at all, and that'll just read and it'll just build up a lot more dirtier and heavier, that accumulation that would naturally get into those gaps over the time because his feet are naturally nearer the floor. But once I have applied the decrepit filth, I'll let it dry for around 15 minutes, or you can use a hairdryer to gently flash off those mineral spirits. So after that enamel has dried, I'm going to then return with the same brush, and I'm going to make sure that my brush is clean and it's just lightly dampened with mineral spirit. It's just enough to reactivate that enamel, not enough to make it splash or dissipate anywhere. But for this, I'm going to use this to push any excess back into those crevices. It's almost like retracting the steps that I've previously done, just cleaning it up as I go. And in some areas, I'll even pull the enamel out of the recesses to create some subtle streaks or feathered transitions. This is the real strength of enamels in my eyes. They give you almost unlimited control over both placement and finish. And if you get a larger area that needs cleaning, you can simply come in there with a cotton Q-tip or a sponge dampened very lightly with mineral spirits to remove any of that excess. Again, let that dry for a short while and then we can move on to some more additional enamels. Now at this stage I did want to introduce a little bit more colour variation because we've got some nice dark grime on there and it's deepened those shadows for us in the crevices. So for this, and to add some more variation, I'm going to turn to Villainy Ink Goons Grime. I'm not adding any rust or corrosion on this miniature, just some subtle grime streaks to add some visual interest and break some things up. But once that's done, again, I'll allow that to dry for around 15 minutes before moving on. So the next part of weathering that I am going to add to this miniature, and this were inspired a lot from the Warhammer Secret Level from the Amazon show, and I've found that on their miniatures they're really dusty, but this effect will also work great on any of your miniatures just to add some general rust. And for this I'm going to be using Villainy Ink All Is Dust, and it's excellent, like I said, for adding that bit more chalkier, dustier textures, and this can be applied neat with a brush or sprayed through an airbrush. but when I first apply it, it can be a little bit difficult to judge the final effect until it actually starts to dry, because once it starts drying, that's where the dusty effect really starts to take place. I usually work with a hairdryer in one hand and my brush in the other hand, moving around the model as I go. But once the oil dust is dry, it can be further manipulated using a clean brush or a cotton bud. I recommend removing it dry rather than with the mineral spirits if you want to preserve that dusty chalky finish. However, if you do find that the effect is a little bit too strong, first dust it off with a clean brush or just a dry removal pass with a Q-tip. But if it's a little bit harder or you want to tone it down a little bit more, you can then come in with a little bit more mineral spirits just to work it, reactivate it and work that back off. But another great use for all his dust is an actual desaturation filter. For example, if an area like the cape feels a little bit too vibrant, applying this product will subtly knock that saturation back whilst maintaining that grimy, weathered feel. So now at this point the weathering steps is complete and you could quite comfortably leave the model here and call it finished. But as you can see, by altering the approach earlier in the process, we don't really need to heavily rely on enamel effects to carry the final results. Instead, they act as a subtle complement to the work that we've already done, and that's sort of been my goal throughout this video, is to go back to the basics and just, rather than relying heavily on enamels and all special effects, is just to use them to complement the work that we've previously done. So the last thing I'm going to add to this miniature is a little bit of a glow on his power swords, and this is a really easy, simple way to be able to do this, and it's just a case of grabbing some white paint through your airbrush and just spraying in a white glow first of all, and then I came in with the contrast paint Frost Art and just gave it a light glaze over that white. If you want it to be really prominent and really bright, you can just go back to your white at the last and just do a final little tiny little dot right in the center where the glow is emanating from. It's just a really quick and easy technique, and this recipe, you can simply get any color glow that you like by simply changing the color of that contrast or speed paint. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. So my main takeaway from this video is for you to be able to take a small step back and really focus on the basics first, building up textures, volumes and a solid acrylic work. And once that foundation is there, we can then move on to the enamels and weathering. But instead of relying heavily on enamel washes, oils or other products, we can use them as a complementary step rather than the main focus. And by changing our approach, we're able to achieve a much more detailed miniature without actually adding any more work. Even with all these small steps, we haven't really changed the overall formula. If anything, we've actually skipped or cut out a few of the steps that we normally would add. But by rethinking how we use acrylics, we can speed up that process and still get better results at the same time. With all that said, I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and I will catch you in the next video.